Hello and welcome to the Vancouver Writers Fest. My name is Leslie Hurtig and I'm the Artistic Director. I'm so happy to welcome you to this event featuring Oliver Jeffers. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work in this event today on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're very grateful to be here. I would also like to thank our government sponsors, CMHC Granville Island, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Arts Council, the Government of BC, and the City of Vancouver. Also, I'd like to send my great thanks to Arts Umbrella for their collaboration in putting this event on today. Oliver Jeffers is joining us from Belfast, Ireland. He's a visual artist and storyteller, the author of multiple award-winning and best-selling children's books. In fact, they've sold over 12 million copies worldwide and been translated into over 45 languages. His artwork has appeared in galleries around the world, including the National Portrait Gallery in London, the Brooklyn Museum in New York, and the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, among others. Please welcome Oliver Jeffers.
Good afternoon, good evening, people of the internet in Vancouver. I come to you via the wonders of space-time and technology with this Zoom thing here, which I'd never heard of before it was a global pandemic. And yes, with special thanks to germs, because the truth is that I probably wouldn't have been able to come to Vancouver at this time of year had it not been for this global pandemic. But here we are, we're figuring out how to talk via the wonderful ways of the internet. And don't know if you can hear that, but that's an airplane that just went past, and I forgot that I'm in a flight path, but hopefully that's going to be the last one for the remainder of this talk. So it is thanks partly to COVID that we're doing this now, and in times like this, you gotta rely on those little blessings. Here we are, me in your home, and you in, well, also your home. Looking at your computer, anyway, on your computer. I have things to say and show, mostly about books, some art, and hopefully it'll provide you with some light relief or some cosmic introspection, though I can't promise both, or either, really. So hopefully a half an hour has passed by the time that you get to the end of this. I do hope you're doing well. I really do. It's been a very trying time for humanity, hasn't it? It's been trying for each and every individual one of us, this whole thing. And I don't know about there, but looks like here in Northern Ireland, we are about to go into a second lockdown, which is not going to be fun. One thing's for sure that got me through this whole thing so far is knowing that I'm not alone, that everybody else is suffering too. Probably even more so. So thank you for that. Thank you for suffering more so that I can feel all right about myself. I do genuinely hope that everybody is staying safe and sane and practicing good hygiene and common sense. And I genuinely mean that because I don't think I can go through another round of this, even though it does look like it's coming. I assume most of you know who I am, considering that you've purchased tickets to watch me speak at a virtual literary festival on your computer. But for those of you who don't, my name is Oliver. And this is what I look like. This is a picture of me in my brother's studio. Because normally I live in Brooklyn, but we got caught off guard 3,000 miles away from my studio when this all started, and I haven't been back since. The picture on that hat of a bee is for Brooklyn, where I normally live. But since March, we've been in Belfast, and actually that's what the bee in the hat is for. It's a city I grew up in. And it's here that I've retreated back in March to be closer to family. And you may notice that I talk differently from you and from most people. And that's because this is the way people from Belfast talk. And there's not that many of us. And if you're not sure where Belfast is, it is here. And here's a little more context if you need it. This is a literary festival after all. And you probably love books. I also love books. It's a rare night that I'll not read at least a few pages of at least one book, something, before I fall asleep. And normally I have around half a dozen books on the go, depending on what mood I'm in. Some fiction, some non-fiction, some history, some comedy, some tragedy, all over the place, even poetry. You'd think that my kids would be really, really super into books, and they do love them, but strangely, I have never wanted to shove books down their throats because I didn't really like books. It's my dirty secret. I didn't really like books when I was growing up because it always felt like it was homework. That was something that I had to do for somebody else. And it wasn't until I was really in art college, when I was, my late teens, that I discovered a love for reading. And only then is because it was my idea to read. It wasn't homework. It wasn't a chore for somebody else. But I heard once somebody say about education that education is what someone else does to you, and learning is what you do to yourself. I'm not sure who said that, but it's not until I really sincerely wanted to find out about something that it occurred to me to read about it and find out what happened or how something works. And then reading was on my terms, and I haven't been able to put books down since. And I've come to realize that there's an awful lot we don't know. There are 4 quadrants of knowledge, and this, as you can see, that by far and away the largest is what we are not aware of not knowing. In other words, the more you know you don't know. So the greatest scientific discovery that ever took place was the discovery of ignorance, as Noah Yuval Harari said. And if you think about it, retaining facts doesn't really prove intelligence. That just proves memory. And I was raised to believe that the surest sign of intelligence in a human being is curiosity and imagination. My dad said that. I think my sense of storytelling is one of the most important things that has come from being raised in Belfast in Northern Ireland. We are an island of storytellers, and a good story is often the highest priority. That's why I heard this a lot growing up, and I've often repeated it. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Though I've recently had to make a caveat, unless you're a journalist, or 2, or a word later. There is an art to telling a story. And a long exposure to good storytellers has infused itself in my work, both in the way that you see it and the way that you hear it, read it. Before I get into picture books, I was practicing as a painter. That's what I always thought I wanted to be when I grew up, as an artist, a painter. And I thought it was what I was always going to do. And all of my early visual work, all my paintings and drawings, although I didn't realize it then, has always been about storytelling. These early canvases that I'm showing you now were showing a scene that had either the momentum of energy or like a story in the middle of being told, or a series of clues that you could put something together in your head. They were showing the potential for a story, or something that had just happened and you had to imagine what the story was that led to like all these clues. And it was always up to the viewer to put things together in their own mind. And basically each painting that I was making was either the beginning, the middle, or the end of a story. I just hadn't put all 3 things together yet. And those 3 things are probably the most important 3 things in a story. You need your beginning, your middle, and your end. You've always got your setup, your introduction to the world, the introduction of a problem, that's the middle, and then your resolution, and that's the end. I always knew I wanted to be an artist, and I've always loved drawing, though I haven't always been good at drawing. Here is the way that I used to draw people. And it's not very good, is it? No, it's not. It's terrible, actually. But that's because this is before I went to art college. And then I went to art college, and I studied form and function and art history and light, shadow, perspective, etc. for 4 years. And I left with a degree in fine arts. And now I draw like this, which is so much better, don't you think? Yeah, I'm pretty proud of that one. The first picture book I made didn't actually start out life as a picture book. It was originally supposed to just be one painting, and then a series of paintings, all about the idea of somebody trying to do something physically impossible. In this case, trying to catch a star. And then at a certain point, it occurred to me that maybe this would be better suited to a book rather than just 4 or 5 individual canvases. And I decided that's what I would do. And I made it into a book. I turned it into a picture book, and it reminded me of all these stories that I heard when I was a kid, and it all just came flooding back. And after I graduated from our college, I decided that I would never, ever get a real job. I went about getting this book published, which went well. HarperCollins asked me, I sent the book to them, and they said, yes, we will publish this. And then they said that you have other book ideas, right? This isn't just a one-off. And I was like, of course I do. But I will draw your attention back to an earlier statement. I had no idea what I was doing. But then Lost and Found was my second book, and it was very difficult to make as I tried to work out how to repeat this process that I'd sort of stumbled upon by accident. It was like that tricky second album that you always hear bands talking about. But after Lost and Found, I began to find my rhythm a little bit, and other books started happening, well, more naturally, more organically, more kind of, I got the flow earlier and earlier. And it seems that I maybe wasn't lying as quite as much as I thought I was in that first original HarperCollins meeting. So I made lots and lots of books. My grandfather always did teach me that if you want to get in anywhere for free, simply walk in backwards with confidence and they'll think you're leaving. The key word in that sentence is confidence. Because the truth is that I did feel like a fraud when I was beginning, when I was starting out, that it's like, I shouldn't be getting away with this. My work's not good enough. And I've come to realize over time that I've actually turned into the artist that I was pretending to be as a younger self. Because no one comes out fully formed. Anyone whose work you admire, they started off not very good somewhere and they figured it out as they went. And self-confidence and believing in your work is absolutely paramount to this. Because, making a decision without second-guessing yourself. If you don't believe in your own work, nobody else will. It's not that you're lying at the outset. It's just that you're giving your certain way of saying and seeing things a chance. You're giving it some value, a platform on which to stand. And that's what sets you apart, is your particular way of saying or seeing things. As Oscar Wilde always said, be yourself. Everybody else is taken. So then again, all of us invent ourselves. Some of us just have more imagination than the others. And I never thought I'd be dropping some sheer wisdom after an Oscar Wilde quote, but there you are. I would often switch around with styles and materials, never really settling on one particular way of doing things, one formula. Always different things, different types of things interested me. And it's rare that I would look back and fully see what worked or kind of, bask in the glory of a project. But rather I would just keep plowing ahead. What's next? What am I doing next? What interests me? And finding new ideas and new ways of working rather than just repeating myself. The oddest and riskiest technical experiment I've ever made, came through my most recent book, The Fate of Fausto. The notion for this story came, actually, I was in a car up on the north coast of Northern Ireland taking a nap, and I was just watching the storm roll in over the North Atlantic, and the sheer power that you could see for miles, just the sheer size and power of the storm was really enthralling. And I just lost myself, drifted off, dozed for a minute, and then kind of woke up with this story, The Fate of Fausto, on the tip of my lips. And I basically wrote it down in a notepad that I had with me. And there's that notepad you can see. And if you can read that, the story really didn't change very much from that burst of writing. All the objects in the book are those things that I saw immediately around me in this field as I was looking about: a flower, a sheep, a field, a tree, a lake. And it goes like this. There was once a man who believed he owned everything and set out to survey what was his. He easily claims ownership of a flower, a sheep, a tree, and a field. The lake and the mountain prove harder to conquer, but they too surrender. And it's whenever, whenever Fausto tries to go and own the open sea, that's where his greed proves his undoing, because in a fit of arrogance, he climbs overboard to show the sea who is boss, which is not a wise move if you don't know how to swim. And this is a story that's all about the follies of arrogance and greed, those classic vices of capitalism. And the styling of Fausto, the way he looks as a character, is done in the fashion of classic British bankers of the 19th and early 20th century. The character is not based on any obvious contenders that you might think, because I actually had this idea and I wrote the story from start to finish and started doing the first drawings way back in 2015, before any of the obvious contenders in global politics came on the scene. But then I sidelined this whole book project. I sidelined for a couple of years when something else came along that felt more, timely or appropriate. But more on that later. The ethos of the book, The Fate of Fausto, is basically summed up in this poem that's contained at the end, Joe Heller by Kurt Vonnegut. And it goes like this. True story, word of honor. Joseph Heller, an important and funny writer, now dead, and I were at a party given by a billionaire on Shelter Island. I said, Joe, how does it make you feel to know that our host only yesterday may have made more money than your novel Catch-22 has earned in its entire history? And Joe said, I've got something he can never have. And I said, what on earth could that be, Joe? And Joe said, the knowledge that I've got enough. Not bad. Rest in peace. And that is by Kurt Vonnegut. This whole book felt like a sort of timeless story, like it could have been written a century ago, maybe. I wanted to make the art for it in a way that honored classic storybooks from the past. So I hark back to some of the earlier modes and methods of printing as a way to try and make this book, as a way to try and make the art for this book. All of the art was made in the esteemed lithographic printing press in the 16th arrondissement in Paris called Idem. And I used this same exact press that Picasso, Matisse, Miro, and Cézanne all used at one point through the 20s, 30s, 40s. It just felt magical, and the history and the culture was rich in this place. And lithography is a very tricky technique. If you've never used it before, it's basically you have to work backwards, often upside down, and with a 3 or 4 hour time delay to know what two things will look like together. So it's mostly guesswork of how it all turns out. And it's a slow and frustrating, but often beautiful and surprising process. With hindsight, I realized that the loss of control in the art making was actually somehow really fitting for the theme of this book. The font choice that I made also was referencing books of old. And it was done by this type designer called David Pearson, and he selected a font that had never ever been digitized before. And he typeset the whole book by hand using the original traditional lead type blocks. It's one of 3 ways in which the old bookmaking techniques were honored, and that the last one was that I had bespoke marbling done for the end papers. And you can see the process there happening and then how it looks in the book. And one at the start to show the water at the end of the book, and one at the beginning to show like the earth colors and the leaves of the dried natural elements at the beginning of the book. So at the end of the story, Fausto comes to a grim and watery end as he completely oversteps his bounds. And as much as this book is about greed and arrogance, it's also about humanity's relationship with our environment. Because for too long, we human beings have thought of ourselves as separate from somehow and superior to nature. And it's this mindset of arrogance that has largely led us to the condition and the state of global climate that we're in right now. Anyone who follows me on social media knows that I am quite vocal on the issue of climate change. And even with everything that's going on in a global pandemic, I truly believe that our willful ignorance in addressing this looming disaster in any appropriate manner is the greatest threat to humanity as we know it, as we've probably ever known it. In an article I wrote for Time magazine in July of this year, and a not so humble brag that I managed to get my name on the cover alongside the Dalai Lama and Greta Thunberg. It's there, you can see it. But in this article, I likened our stance on climate change to a scene in the original Austin Powers movie where a guard is screaming in terror at this approaching steamroller that's surely going to crush him, only for the camera to pull back and reveal that the steamroller is actually hundreds of yards away and moving at a snail's pace. But yet the guard remains rooted to the spot, screaming at his impending doom. And that seems a bit like us at the minute, no? Where it's a far-off disaster that terrifies us that we are not doing very much about. In the last few years, I've taken to social media to speak out about environmental concerns and social injustices of all sorts, and I hadn't always done this. Instead, whenever Instagram and Facebook first came around, I was using them to share art and books and pictures and, just talk about where I would be signing and doing talks and so on, and nothing really more. And while, yes, I've always had these political beliefs that I share willingly now, I didn't think it was my place to speak out about them politically. Who was I to say these things? And then 2 things changed this for me completely. I suppose 3 things, realizing that who was I not to say, and if I didn't say them, who would? Because everybody should be saying them. But firstly, it seems from around 2016, early 2016 or late 2015, the world was becoming a much angrier and scarier place for many people living in the Western Hemisphere. Exhibit A, whenever Britain chose to, with little information and massive amounts of not forward thinking, chose to leave the European Union in a mess that is still unfolding. And Exhibit B, the less said about that, the better. And it's possible that having a kid for the first time magnified these feelings for me, because it certainly seemed to be a scary world to be raising a son. And It seemed that much of humanity had forgotten the simple moral codes of conduct that had governed, social behavior previously. So as I was walking around with my son in those early days of his life and explaining the world around me, there was certain amounts of comedy in it, given a tour, somebody who clearly can't speak a word of English. There was also fear as I began to realize that he didn't know anything, and it was up to me to try and teach this new human life everything that he would need to know to navigate this future world. And I began writing down these wildly simple observations I was making in a sort of attempt to write him a letter about the way the world is supposed to work. But as I was doing it, I was reminding myself of these simple truths as well, about the basic principles of what it is to be a human living on Earth in the 21st century. And that letter turned into a book called Here We Are, Notes for Living on Planet Earth. As I realized that other people maybe would benefit from hearing these things too, or re-remembering them. And it was this project that sidelined the fate of Fausto by a couple of years, because I suddenly felt it was important to underline these principles of kindness and unity rather than just pointing out how we've gone wrong. And those simple messages of kindness and unity, things like, on this planet there are people. People come in many shapes, sizes, and colors. We may all act different, look different, and sound different, but don't be fooled. We are all people. One of the central themes of the book is Earth's place in space. And I thought a lot about how it's pretty lonely out there. There's no one else about. There's no one else outside of our atmosphere, really. And I was researching quotes from astronauts to include in the end of this book. And I discovered a phenomenon known as the overview effect, which is what happens when anyone who has ever been far enough away from Earth can look back and see our planet as a single object, see it in its entirety, and realize that it's just one system. The notion of countries and borders suddenly become obsolete. And the petty conflicts that seem to demand most of our attention are just really insignificant in comparison to just realizing the beautiful fragility of our planet. And having lived in Brooklyn, in New York for over a decade at this point, there was a familiarity in the way in which I was reading and the feeling about the way this was being described. And that's because I'd been using the same sort of language to describe what it was like to come from Northern Ireland, basically describing Northern Irish political history and the violence there that I grew up in from the other side of an ocean, when I realized that no one outside the tiny area of the north part of Ireland, which half the people didn't even know was a separate country, it occurred to me that outside of this place, no one really cared about the conflict. And it all seemed like such a tragic waste of energy. I've been making art about this for some time. Here's this painting, and it's about the difference that a shift in perspective can make. This is a painting it's a large oil painting that I made called A Tea Break from the Unknown. And you'll see in the cups, one has got the iconography from the Catholic national side of the Northern Ireland conflict, and the other has the Protestant loyalist iconography on their cup. And they are both going off and exploring into the unknown and see two very, very different things. I have often been referencing this book in my art for some time. It's called The Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, written by Buckminster Fuller. And in this book, he observed that if we treated our planet like a mechanical vehicle, which in many ways it is, we treat it much better than we currently do. And he was writing about this over 60 years ago. He says that any car owner knows that if you want your vehicle to last any amount of time, you need to maintain it properly. You keep the tires inflated, you refuel it, you top up the radiator if it starts to overheat, things like that. And I've continued this analogy in a lot of my new paintings by suggesting that we are all on this spaceship Earth, but many of us passengers on this vehicle are way too distracted, fighting over what to play on the radio to even notice the smoke coming out of the engine. Growing up in Northern Ireland, I've always had a bit of an identity crisis when it comes to nationality. And as such, questioned and become suspicious of those who are overly nationalistic or patriotic at the expense of everything else. These lines that we draw across the line, these lines that we draw across the land to divide ourselves from each other, to know where we belong and where we don't, they live only in our heads. No other species pays any attention to borders. Neither extreme weather nor germs need passports. And maps have always been used to distort the view of the world of whoever is making the map. Like, for example, Europe has always made Greenland much bigger than it really is, and Africa much smaller than it really is, just so that Europe could appear central in the map. And that's the same with North America. It always severed off Asia in two, so that America will be in the center. And I've been playing about with maps in my work for some time, like this one, where I've taken the liberty of redrawing all of the borders and properly labeling things, either land or sea, because it feels that that's really the only true division of natural habitats. Or this one. This map is upside down, but all the countries are labeled the right way up, because in reality, it's completely arbitrary that south is at the bottom of maps. And the point of this was to show that something familiar can suddenly seem really quite different when it's viewed from another perspective. You know, you look at this map and suddenly everything seems off. The country that you're from doesn't seem like it should. And even today, most of humanity's conflicts come from the idea of national identity and immigration, man-made problems that have nothing at all to do with a cosmological perspective. It's hard to imagine just how alone we are in the universe, and that everything we've ever known has been confined to this one single planet. And Carl Sagan, I've always thought, said it best when he said, "On this pale blue dot, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam." And it's also hard to imagine just how small and fragile this planet is in reality. There have never been any accurate scale models of our solar system because there's just simply too much space in between everything. If you wanted to have one where Earth was large enough to be seen by the naked eye, you'd need over 5 miles to get from the sun to Neptune, and the largest of those objects will be a beach ball, and that will be the sun. It's very big out there. I did make a sculpture at one point to show the accurate distance between our planet Earth and the only thing even remotely near us, which is our moon. And that's 250,000 miles away. And this is an image of that being prepared at the studio. And the sculpture was called The Moon, the Earth and Us, and it appeared in January 2019 in New York City's Highline Park, the time with the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8's mission around the moon, and where the first ever photograph of our Earth was seen in its entirety, that famous photo called Earthrise. So at the scale of this sculpture, the Earth is 10 feet in diameter, and the moon is 2 feet, and a city block, a New York City block, about 200 feet away. The next close object at this scale would be Mars, and that would be about the size of a yoga ball, and it would be 1.25 miles away. So the point of this sculpture was to show that people can only live on Earth. There's nowhere else for us to go. And even on this planet, only 4% of the surface of our planet is habitable human life. Most of it is water, and the bits of land that are there, many of them are either way too high up in the mountains, the altitude where there's not enough air, or they're way too hot or way too marshy, whatever it might be. 4% of the surface of our planet is habitable human life, and this is where people live. So as you approach the Earth from the moon, you can slowly make out the lines of borders, but instead of the country names, inside every single place is written the simple truth that people live here over and over again. It portrays the reality that the Earth is all alone in space, and this is the only place that people live. Though when you take a different perspective, as was the climactic point of the Apple TV adaptation of my book, Here We Are, that was beautifully made by Studio AKA, if this is where all the people live, then actually planet Earth is the least lonely place in the entire universe.
Here we are on Earth. When you travel far enough away from Earth, one thing becomes clear. This planet, alone in the cosmos, is the place where people live. And live we do. Life on Earth is a wonderful thing. It looks big, but there are lots of us on here. 7.5 billion at last count, with more showing up every day. Even so, there is still enough for everyone, if we all share a little. So please, be kind. Of course, there is so much more for you to learn about living on planet Earth. But for now, these are the things we think you need to know.
My son calls this his film, which I suppose it is. If he hadn't come along, it never would have been made. But he has a sister now. I knew that I'd never hear the end of it if she didn't get a book as well. When he was born, Here We Are was written for him as I tried to make sense of the world for both of us as it was at that moment. When our daughter was born, it's a good thing I was experiencing a not dissimilar internal dialogue of transition with new parenthood that proved to be good material for a book. For one thing, contemplating the importance of raising a daughter in what will hopefully soon no longer be a man's world. She is the first female Jeffers in 4 generations, and thinking about how different the world might be for her as an adult to what it was for the last time there was a female Jeffers in our family close to 100 years ago. If Here We Are is about understanding the world, then what we'll build is about changing it, about planning for a better one. But more than that, it's a poem that really contemplates what home is, the importance of family, but also the strength of the invisible bonds of any loving relationship, through thick and through thin. It's all about the pure potential of what will come, both darkness and joy, and how ultimately people need each other. We need hope and joy and each other to get through. And even if that's just for someone else to hear all your plans. And I did think that this book was made before lockdown happened, and I thought that I was a little sad that it was about the old world, made in the old world, and it just was going to lose all its resonance. But of course, what I've only come to realize is that at the time of writing and making this book, me and my daughter were facing an unknown future because she'd never been here before. But now, of course, every single person on earth is facing an unknown future. What shall we build, you and I? Let's build a door where there was none. Let's build a house to be our home. Let's build some love to set aside, then build a hole where we can hide. And that is all you're getting for now. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for joining us at the Vancouver Writers Fest, Oliver. I hope you'll join us in person in Vancouver sometime in the near future.
I certainly hope I can in the near future, as soon as possible, as far as I'm concerned.
And keep well. Thank you.
Thank you, and you too. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.